Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm situated on Whadjuk Noongar country, and that Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land, continuing to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Those joining remotely are invited to acknowledge their respect for the Indigenous peoples on the lands on which they sit, and to pay their respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining today's session, which looks like it's going to be a wonderful 3 papers under the theme of the importance of continuing culture. First up, I'm going to ask Mark Riboldi, and I'll let you introduce yourself, Mark, just to save time. Do you want a time?
Yeah, we have 20 minutes, is that
20 minutes, yeah.
And do you mind maybe just telling me at 15?
At 15?
To say you've got 5 minutes, stop rambling.
Yeah, I'll put up my hand.
Is that fine? Yeah, up there, I think it's cool. All right, I'll get going then, if that's all right. I'll also acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Mark Riboldi from the University of Sydney. I live and work on Gadigal country in Sydney, and I was born and raised on Darug country a bit further west, and in Western Sydney out there. So I'm today going to be talking about an aspect of my PhD research. I'm about a couple of years in. I'm going to finish next year, and largely I'm looking at the importance of, or the relation to, community connection for civil society advocacy. So that relationship that people have with the organisations that claim to represent and serve them. So that's kind of my main area of interest, and so I'm going to be talking through just an aspect of that today. Just in terms of, I guess, setting that up. So there's, I guess, what might be called a civil society dilemma, and the first part of that, whoops, I need the calendar. The first part of that, there's kind of these expectations about what civil society is and what it's supposed to do. So there's, those kind of old school American de Tocqueville ideas that, civil society is this kind of defense against the power and the overreach of the state, or in a kind of modern European sense coming out of the end of the Cold War, that sense that, again, civil society is where the democratic action that happens that kind of helps people mediate power between those big interests of the market and the state. So that's, I guess, what I would call, a bit of expectations about what civil society and what civil society organisations can be. Part of the problem, then there's my sort of graphic. And then part of the problem, though, is that there are, in practice, I guess, there are kind of questions about whether these organisations that we're talking about have the legitimacy of being connected to those organisations, whether people argue about what's the definition of a civil society organisation, what's an NGO, what's not-for-profit, what's a social thing, what's this, what's that. A lot of it's kind of tax brackets and funding conditions that kind of create those things. And then also maybe the more important one is about impact. And so, are they actually doing the thing that they say that they're going to do? And so here, I guess, are some of those kind of pressures that are on civil society organisations that I'm interested in. So you've got, as people have talked about in the last couple of sessions, that kind of government-funded service delivery is largely dictated by the state about what they do. So is that really helping people mediate power between where they are in the state? You kind of go, there's restrictions on advocacy. So again, a bit of something that works against that normative ideal of what civil society is. Corporate governance, which has kind of become very popularised in civil society organisations. We don't have kind of heads of organisations anymore. We've got CEOs of particular organisations, very kind of corporate governance. And then the way that organisations mobilise or engage with people and communities has become quite transactional. So the very simple example of that is organisations using crowdsourcing and crowdfunding of mobilising volunteers, so just getting people to sign e-petitions is a very transactional way of doing it, or getting people to kind of donate in a very transactional way. So those are kind of, I guess, some of the tensions between the ideal of what a civil society organisation should be and the practice of where it is. So that I'm kind of interested in that kind of the space of conflict and how we might help civil society organisations navigate that to kind of orient back towards, you've got these big arrows coming down here for organisations. I'm interested in how do we turn it around a bit and help organisations reorient back towards people and communities. So in terms of the Australian context of this, there's three quite important aspects that's worth us taking consideration of. The first is obviously the impact of colonisation. So unlike in the US or UK or parts of Europe where civil society kind of grows up based on people outside the state doing things together, in Australia, civil society comes with the state. So the original organisations like Benevolent or organisations who've been around for a very long time came with the state, and they were very much a part of implementing state policies, including removing children from First Nations homes and culture and country. So another aspect there, is that marketisation, which Ruth Phillips, who was chairing the panel earlier, talks quite a lot about. So it's not just about the outsourcing or the privatising of services, it's the marketisation of services, kind of throwing those organisations into conflict with each other. And the third thing in Australia that Richard Dennis has talked about quite a lot, and so I won't go into it, just those kind of attacks on CSO advocacy or civil society advocacy, so the kind of pressures to stop them from doing that. So my question is broadly, how can Australian civil society organisations kind of reinvigorate their relationships with people and communities? So theoretically, I'm drawing on three different theoretical frameworks around how people and connect with different organisations. So this is one of the famous ones. Einstein in 1969 talks about a ladder of citizen participation, which is the different ways that state, and her study was around some governments in the United States, how they relate to people. So there's obviously going from here, which is the not good part, or the anti-democratic part, I might call, more towards kind of partnership, deliberation and control. And this is kind of the contested ground. We might think about how our governments relate to us, and they kind of inform, they consult, they placate. And so it's, this is questionable about here, about the way that we do it might tend to be more democratic than the others. Similarly, Kay Lawson, anyway, you can work out that says clientelistic and responsive. So Kay Lawson talks about how people relate to political parties and how they respond to them. So a relationship, for example, between the Labor Party, if it's coercive, that's anti-democratic, or undemocratic, that's participatory, it's democratic. And then again, in the middle, there's this kind of the way that you might do educative or responsive or clientelistic things. It doesn't go one way or the other, kind of depends on the way that's kind of being done. And then the third one, who's my favourite, is Harry Hahn, who's a social movement scholar. And she talks about the difference between transactional and transformational. And this doesn't fit exactly on these kind of scales. So it's not necessarily that everything that is transactional, like those e-petitions, is anti-democratic. But it is kind of, I guess, more if your organisation is only doing transactional things, so only getting people to sign e-petitions, only getting people to give donations, only doing kind of direct service interventions. It's not particularly, it's very transactional. It's not particularly involving the people in it. So at the other end of the scale is kind of transformational, so things like leadership development, kind of like putting people in rooms which they have the chance to transform themselves, which is kind of more democratic. So Lawson talks, Harry Hahn talks about how effective civil society organisations combine both transactional mobilising and transformational organising. So you can't do one without the other. If you're going to be effective as a social movement organisation or a civic association, you have to do both of them. If you're only doing one, you're not very effective. If you're only talking about leadership development, are you really kind of mobilising people towards power at the right time? If you're only doing transactional kind of things, are you really actually changing the democratic conditions that we operate under? So for me, from this, it kind of tells me two things. One is that civil society, what they do can be democratic or undemocratic. Just because we call ourselves an NGO or a civil society organisation doesn't mean that we're necessarily becoming doing democratic things. And then, as I said from Harry Hahn, that civil society organisations need to combine those transactional and transformational activities that have a democratic impact. So I'm kind of testing those. I've kind of worked out that to do that, a lot of that's talking about activities. So it's talking about what organisations do. So I'm not interested in how organisations define themselves. I'm not interested in what their relationship is with government. I'm interested in what they actually do. So I worked out in the course of my PhD that I need to kind of work out a typology of activity that civil society organisations do. So in terms of advocacy, this is reasonably well defined, but in terms of like a broad scale of civil society, it's not really well stepped out, at least from what I've been able to find so far. So I'm using a couple of methodology things that are not that interesting, and I can talk about later for people who are really interested in that kind of stuff. But basically, I'll just put these up and then stop that. I'll go back. Keyboard. Oh, cool, there's a keyboard. Excellent. So basically, during COVID, I ran 54 semi-structured or unstructured interviews, depending on how it went, and 12 focus groups with about 110 civil society practitioners, mainly in New South Wales, because that's where I was based, but also in different parts around the country, and mainly talking about their experience during COVID of trying to do what they were already doing, and what was successful, what didn't work, what new challenges came up, what old challenges were there. And then through this, it's kind of coming up with a series of stories, reflections, and observations of them trying to help people. So for me, they're doing a lot of stuff, and so I'm interested in what are the things that you're actually doing. These are the kind of organisations that we talk about, if I kind of categorise them by organisation type, which some people like to do. So they're kind of the ones that might normally get talked about in terms of civil society organisations. We talk about service delivery organisations, community service providers, whatever we want to call them. We might talk about advocacy organisations all the time, interest groups. There's a whole lot of, if we're at a university, so we can talk about research groups. There's a whole lot of other stuff in here that from the people that we talked to, that I couldn't categorise them as service delivery or advocacy, but they're still doing a lot of stuff and still doing really important things. Charity and service delivery can debate whether one's different than the other. The ones that I find quite interesting are these intermediary organisations. I'll come back to them a little bit later. And then some of these kind of community development and community organising things, in the context of what we were talking about at least, became quite important. So when I started, let's look at that first level coding or the second level one, really. But basically, I can talk about those things later for people who are really interested in coding and matrices and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, when I started going through all of these different activities that people were doing, and I'm trying to come up with, I guess, a bit of a matrix or a typology of what kind of activities can we say that civil society organisations do. And so the basic story of that is I started with a lot, and I'm trying to get down to less, because less is much easier to, I guess, understand and work through for me particularly. So these are the initial results of what we're getting. So people that would recognise these things that we talked about, so advocating systemically is kind of a thing that organisations do all the time. Provide charity, deliver service, even coordinate volunteers is something that social movement organisations do all the time. Of course, if you're an organisation, you need to administer yourself and you need to have governance structures and all those kind of things. Some of the ones that may be less recognised or less thought about when we're thinking about how civil society organisations work is when we're thinking about coordinating networks. So if you can see from here, this is just a very rough coding of analysis of where we're at now. But so pretty much every single civil society organisation talks about how they work collaboratively with other people and other organisations. But less people talk about the way in which those networks are coordinated. And this is kind of what's emerging in part of the research as well, that this is actually really important. So it's not just, if you think about that question of, is it democratic or is it anti-democratic? So if you can work collaboratively with each other, that's great. But just because you're working collaboratively or you're working with someone else doesn't necessarily mean you're being effective. And so the way that these organisations are coordinated, the networks are coordinated, is kind of emerging as particularly important. These are just bits that I need to work on, I guess. So that idea of what's the difference between delivering a service and providing charity. I need to kind of tease those two things out. I think it'll be clearer to make this typology work better. And as I mentioned, there's something really, for me, quite interesting in what's going on here between the working collaboration. As people were saying this morning, this work is largely unfunded. So civil society organisations, or you would know if you're a part of an organisation, if you've worked in an organisation, you don't necessarily get funded to work with other people. You get funded to doing, delivering beds and things like that. And people don't get paid, particularly, to coordinate the network in a way that's particularly effective. So I'm becoming more and more interested in this in my studies. So in terms of, I guess, the results, or second level of results around the research that we're doing, is that so I'll go back here. So yes, these are all the activities that from the organisations that I've been talking to and people. These are the activities that they're doing so far, and these activities don't happen in isolation. They happen within stories. So they happen within the context of international students. And I'll talk about that in a moment more. They happen in terms of food security, like how different organisations come together to make sure people put food on the table. They happen in the Melbourne Towers lockdown, the way that remote Aboriginal communities responded to the pandemic. So this is where the activities are happening, and you can't really separate them from the context that they're occurring in. Well, I don't think we can anyway. Just in terms of the civil society organisations supporting international students during COVID. So this is based on 12 interviews. I'm talking about this tomorrow in more depth. But if we think about, these are all the organisations who helped international students in Sydney during the pandemic, and they helped them organise, they helped them get access to services, they helped them create an organisation. There was International Student Hub, they're getting national media. And so all these organisations are involved in a coalition that the Sydney Alliance is convening. And so the Sydney Alliance is convening this network in a very specific way, based around their community organising principles of relational intent. And if we only thought about those main organisations that we normally think of, the interest groups and the advocacy groups, we only think about what Get Up, Red Jesuits, the Red Cross and Democracy in Colour does, but we ignore the important role of the Sydney Alliance. Addison Road Community Organisation, if they didn't have a space to meet and organise and do things, none of the rest of it would have happened at all. The Migrant Justice Initiative and Sydney Community Forum are both organisations run by people of colour, and so they did a lot of work with the students building capacity to make sure that they could be in the same room for people from Get Up and the Australian Red Cross and participate as equals and actually be listened to. So yeah, in terms of that, I guess it's kind of, that's not that interesting, I don't think. It's just a nice crap I can talk about it later. But basically, Addison Road, the things that they're doing is hosting the space. So again, if it doesn't happen, the Sydney Alliance as well are hosting the space. So if we don't think about these organisations and what they do, these activities don't happen. If I go back to think about those international students and those activities, that typology, they all exist in some form or another. I mean, obviously, when they're talking about COVID, they're not talking about how they administer themselves. They're not necessarily talking about, how they're working collaboratively, but they are talking about how the network gets coordinated. So with this one story, I guess the moral of that story is all of these activities are happening and interacting with each other. Of course, my analysis is unfinished, so I've only analysed maybe 2/3 of the data that I've got at the moment. Also, this is activity within COVID. So the question is really, yes, they're doing this within COVID, but if we look at what's happening outside of the crisis or outside of COVID, is it going to be the same kind of thing? So that's just things that I need to work on and do. I guess the main finding results that are that, civil society organisations work in collaboration with each other, and that collaboration is focused on immediate need. But we're not looking at these organisations as they interact with each other. We're looking at them individually. We're looking at their relationships with the government, but not looking at their relationships with themselves or with the communities that they're going on. For me, my next steps, I need to keep on refining the analysis. I want to go back to that scale of transactional and transformational and apply all these activities to those and kind of understand how they work better. And then I need to test it for accuracy for use. And then we're going to go back to those organisations like the international students, who I'll talk about tomorrow if people are interested, and try and help them to advocate for themselves. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynne. Of course, instructions were to hold the questions till the end. So I'm going to hand straight over to the next group of presenters: Jessica Cox, Libby Kramer, Karen Walsh, Felicity Kime, Charlene Watson, and Maddie Henaway. So we've got a whole mob. The people on the screen, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear, Lynne.
Yeah, so you can hear the presenters all right?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We're going to do a panel discussion.
Bring the chairs down here.
If the chairs are coming over.
Can we also bring up the logo?
And Libby Flip is on our panel as well. Just while we're settling, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous land on which we're meeting, elders past and present. And as we introduce ourselves, we'll each acknowledge the country we come from. I come from Jagera and Turrbal people in Brisbane, Queensland.
I'm Maddie. I'm a Birragubba South Islander woman with ties to Torres Strait. It's a mouthful. And I come from Jagera and Turrbal land in Brisbane as well.
I'm Charlene, I'm a peer worker at Biennial.
I'm Libby Kramer. I'm a non-Aboriginal woman born onto a Wellbeing country in New South Wales and live and work here on Noongar country in WA. I'm the CEO of Family Inclusion Network in WA.
And Flip.
And my name is Felicity. I am the president of Family Inclusion Studies in the Hunter. I'm a parent PE worker and I am on a Wabakoo land here in Newcastle, New South Wales.
I'm Karen Walsh. I'm the CEO of MICA and work with the Family Inclusion Network in Brisbane as well. I'm just going to briefly put the policy context that we work in and that the questions are going to be about, which is really child protection in Australia. And our primary issue about that is that parents are not seen as key stakeholders in the child protection system, and nor does the over $7.5 billion that's spent on the child protection system in Australia adequately resource and support the parents of the children who are in that system. Very briefly. So I'm going to ask a series of questions just as our different experiences from the 3 different states that are represented. And the first I'm going to ask Libby and Charlene. You were part of developing a charter of rights for the parents and families in the child protection system here in Western Australia. Would you like to share the significance and some of your learnings about that process in relation to, the partnership between the third sector and government and parents?
Charlene's mostly going to speak to this, but Charlene, at the beginning, as you walked in, she handed out the Charter of Rights that we're referring to when we're speaking. So if you wanted to just keep that in mind as Charlene's answering some of her questions.
First off, I'd like to say this is Australia's first Charter of Rights for parents and families involved in the child protection matters. So that's pretty significant. There's 6 key points in the Charter, and it's about respect, information, support, fair treatment, participation and inclusion, and privacy and confidentiality. So what resonated for me was knowing that you have a right to be able to take a support person with you to department meetings to make such a difference. So it creates clarity and a working with approach and takes away the you and them vibe and the power imbalance, which we see all the time. It supports its ties with the other 5 points there, but the biggest one is support. This is something I wish I had known a lot sooner than I did, and I feel privileged to have been involved for the 4 years it took to get the final stage and was launched. Even the cover was dissected by myself. We wanted the look of the Charter to be meaningful for families in every setting. The cover, as it is now, can depict a father with his children, his sister and his mother, or a mother with her children and her cousin and her aunt. When we got given the brochure back, it actually had the man standing over the woman with the laptop. So we changed the whole perception of how that even looked for our families. So yeah, it changed the power play. And the different skin tones was to represent diversity and fairness. So yeah, that was my part of it.
Yeah, I wasn't actually a part of it. I'm the CEO that's followed after Debbie Henderson. So Debbie Henderson was with Family Inclusion Network of WA, and when the charter was being developed, it was 4 years in the making. So I've come in at the tail end of that and just, I guess, to take all the glory with Charlene at conferences like this and at the launch. But it was just a really important piece of work because it was the department and the families, along with other service providers, working together to develop something for parents instead of being developed for them or in context of about them as well. So I think if Debbie was here, she would really talk about just the hard work and the hard yards over that 4 years of trying to find a common ground between the department, Family Inclusion Network WA, and then the parents as well. Because we all come from different points of view. We're all trying to get different needs met. But what it comes down to is really making sure that that families know what their rights are, that they're aware of what they can actually do and what they can achieve in that space.
We've actually included them into the parent packs now, and the question we get is, so what are our rights? So, well, where do we start? Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question opener as well.
And what were the parent packs that you're?
Oh, so the parent packs were made by parents for parents, so it includes like a diary and things like keeping everything together. So I was going to bring one, but I forgot.
Maddie, in Queensland, we also worked towards a Charter for Rights, but we took much longer and really nothing had occurred until the formation of the Parents Advisory Committee with the Minister, which is one of the first mechanisms at a formal level of parents as stakeholders in the child protection system, meeting with the Minister and senior departmental issues. So could you give your reflections on that, which was really a committee process, and how that worked for you in getting the charter and other issues through?
Yeah, so we established QPAC, or Queensland Parent Advisory Committee, in Queensland, I believe 3 years ago. Time flies when you're having fun. And that is made up, we made it so there was no power struggle. So there has to be more parents with lived experience of the child protection system on the committee than departmental staff. So our charter came out of that. It was off the back of the WA charter. I wasn't at the meeting that it was, the minister said, yeah, let's do it, but it was the day, I think, or the day after that you guys released yours.
State competition works.
Yeah, yeah. Labor states. And so we used this charter as a base for ours, but in Queensland we have a Human Rights Act. So we were able to work alongside the Queensland Human Rights Commission to kind of give it the teeth that it needed. So it wasn't just like, you know, the government saying, oh yeah, we're going to do this thing and we're going to have participants involved and it's going to reflect and then kind of falls off to the wayside after all the dust settles. So it is not, I guess, like embedded in legislation like the children's rights are, but it has something. And we're still in the implementation phase of it, so trying to roll it out to parents and what does it look like. And also our Human Rights Act is so young, so there's not a lot of case studies to see how it can really be used. So it is really exciting, and the committee is very proud of the work that they've done, rightfully so, because to go from, you know, parents who are scrutinised and judged by every angle of society, more so than, I would argue, more so than anybody else, to being able to be a part of developing something like a Charter of Rights is just monumental, and I think it's a step in the right direction.
I'll go to Felicity.
Can we have Felicity up on the screen?
Yeah.
During the, sorry.
Can we put her on the screen? just while we are, I'd like to acknowledge that Jessica Cox is also from New South Wales, who was really the driver for our presentation today, and is a great leader in this space in Australia, but has been unable to join us for a number of reasons.
While we're doing this, can I check that the people virtually are able to hear the panel that are sitting talking?
I can hear Lynn.
Great, thank you, Samantha.
I can hear. Yep.
Thank you.
So Felicity, the family inclusion strategies in the Hunter, or FISH as it's often referred to, have forged many partnerships with the third sector and with government. And one of those is with Life Without Barriers on how to improve, recruit, assess and support foster carers. Can you tell us a bit about why that's needed and how you're doing the work and what your outcomes from it are?
Yeah, I guess, you know, particularly on this one with Life Without Barriers, they had come to our organisation, you know, wanting to hear from parents, and we're an organisation that can connect with parents. So we partnered with Life Without Barriers to travel around the different states of Australia and run focus groups in each states with 10 plus parents to find out how they navigated the system, how they felt being a part of the system. And what we were hearing is that parents felt like they didn't have a voice, they were never heard, they weren't really a person in the party anyone wanted to work with. And a lot of parents felt that restoration was off the table for them. And I guess I was lucky enough to be a part of that. I travelled a couple of states in a week and got to hear these lovely but very sad stories, and we were able to relay this information back to Life Without Barriers. And what's come from that is that Life Without Barriers has really learnt that, you know, the family inclusive is really important in their practice and really important with their foster carer training as well. You know, bringing all parties together, because this is what it's about, is the best to help the child is all parties being involved. And I guess on the other part is that we're very lucky to work with Life Without Barriers, as we're a parent-led organisation and an advocacy service for parents, that they've helped us get off the ground. You know, we've partnered now with a few different things, going to conferences and doing some submissions, and we wouldn't have been able to do this without their partnership. And I guess what I've learned is that some of these services are quite open to hear from parents and their experiences, and how we can actually learn, and how we can actually put family right in the picture and right at the table, at the centre where it's needed. I guess just summarising all of it up is that for people to look at parents in the child protection system is very unlikely. It's like that we don't have a voice, we don't have any understanding, where LWB is really big on supporting us where they can. And if that is having their workers work with us, or if it's help funding, you know, so we've really now come together on many different occasions, and this wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last time either.
Thanks, Felicity. How much time have we got? 5 minutes. Has anyone got a question that they would like to ask at this point?
I do. I guess, like, I'm working in a sector where I've worked in mental health where the lived experience voices were really prominent and powerful. I'm now working in a new sector where it's almost completely absent. Does the panel have any recommendations on kind of how you can get started in this work, and what are the things that organisations need to consider so that we are safe for those practices to be built and supported?
I think I can answer because we don't do individual advocacy, we only do systemic advocacy. So I think what's really important is, my favourite thing is making sure that policies and programs reflect the people in the community that they're serving. So speaking to people, and it can be quite daunting as well because people will be very critical and very angry, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
So if you kind of let go of that and put your pride to the side, and working groups, focus groups, those sorts of things. But also what's really important is remunerating people for their time, because we're all getting paid, in a room, in a consultation, but participants aren't, and we're asking them for their expertise. So they need to be valued in the same way.
I think also it's about co-designing your stuff from the start with the lived experience in the room, and not just using that as a token, having that lived experience there every step of the way. I've been lucky enough at the moment to be doing a lot of work with Families Australia, and I think it's time that other service just looks at giving us a go. Lived experience is really moving forward in all different sectors, and it's about having a bit of faith and just giving it a go.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, with this Charter of Rights, it was 4 years, as Lukey said, but it was so much to and fro with the department because we wanted to get the language right, we wanted to get every aspect of it right so that people were confident in it. So, and like the difference I've seen, like with myself, having someone come to and support me at meetings was huge. Just the body language, everything changes when you've got someone else sitting there. And I've seen it I go to some meetings with parents and they say to me afterwards, first meeting I've got through in 18 months, and even the caseworkers are going, that's the first meeting she got through in 18 months, so that's huge just to have that kind of support. So, yeah.
I think also from my point of view, in my position, it's working and thinking about everyone that has some, even if it's a small stake in what you're trying to achieve. So obviously working, with people with a lived experience, so walking alongside them respectfully and letting them know that, that their voice is important and doing that systemic work and remunerating people. But then also with the service providers or the funding bodies that usually you're going against almost, but actually, again, working with them collaboratively, despite what you'd actually really like to say, because if you don't get their buy-in from the beginning, you're never going to get it, and then you're also not going to get the funding you need to make that work sustainable. So as much as I think, like with some of our other work, differing perspectives, which is again with the department in partnership, we could have gone and done that work and it would have been great on our own and with parents and with the other service providers, but without the department alongside of us, we would never have got their buy-in unless they were there at the beginning. So I think it's just remembering all of the stakeholders, no matter how big or small, and no matter how much you want to go against, it's just making sure that they're there from the beginning.
Also, your allies in other parts of government, not just the children's. Like for us, a great ally was the Human Rights Commissioner, and it was leveraging of that because it changed the environment we were in compared to before. Like the idea of a charter had been blocked and blocked and blocked because the idea of giving parents more power when everybody knows parents' critique is quite different. So I don't know what sector you're in.
Community label.
Right.
Yeah.
But, it's a really important thing, and I just constantly am in awe of the courage of the parents as advocates, but also just their determination and resilience to how much time it takes, because it's not a fast moving process.
You need to be fierce and patient.
We might have to hold the rest of the questions until after the presentation. That's okay.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. So we'll finish then.
Thank you. That's great. So we now have the third presentation in this set, and both presenters are virtual. I think we have Samantha, Lukey and Fiona first. I'll leave it up to you two to introduce yourselves and get going. And I will give you a 15-minute and then like a 1-minute timing. Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm hoping this works and everybody can hear us okay. I'm up in Byron Bay at the moment and trusting the internet will work well for us.
It's excellent so far.
Okay, great. Just before we do the acknowledgement of country, I just want to say that the terminology we'll be using throughout is, though there are multiple ways to describe First Nations people, for this research, the community specifically requested the use of the term Aboriginal, and this is just one component of a larger PhD research project that I've been doing. Thanks, Fiona.
I'm hoping that everyone can see the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to start out with the acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the lands that have sovereignty, have never ceded, and were, are, and always will be Aboriginal lands. Today, I'm presenting from the Dharawal Nation, and I want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be watching today, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. So this is just a brief outline of the presentation today, going through the stages and the background to the research through a collaborative partnership between the Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation and University of Wollongong. Sam was invited by the Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation to undertake a community-led research on Dharawal country in the Illawarra region. The Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation is, or IAC, is an Aboriginal controlled, community controlled organisation, and the children in our out-of-home care program are living with kinship carers or recruited foster carers. Sam?
Thanks, Fiona. I just want to acknowledge my positionality before I go on. I'm a non-Indigenous woman with English and Scottish heritage, and I'm the mother of 3 children, one of which is a Kamilaroi woman with 2 Kamilaroi children. And I'm actually sitting, well, I said Byron, I'm sitting on Bundjalung country, but I come from Dharawal country. I was born on Dharawal country and I live there. And I also want to say that I recognise social work has played a part in reinforcing oppression and marginalisation of First Nations peoples. And I'm committed to being an ally in the struggle for social justice. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. So this is, in carrying out the research, it was really important to privilege Aboriginal voices. The study, in the way the data was collected, there were 53, Fiona, we've lost, there were 53 participants. 50 of those participants were Aboriginal people and 3 were non-Indigenous people. And this slide just shows you the way Aboriginal voices have been privileged throughout the research project. Thanks, Fiona.
These are the co-researchers. This was at a gathering last week where the artists of the Kumadichi and Sue Truman presented the artworks that they completed as part of Sam's PhD. Sam?
Can we go back just for a second, Fiona, just really quickly? Is that all right?
I'm pretty sure that
I just wanted,
we tested and you were going to do this one. I'm just...
I know, I was meant to be. So at the front, on the right-hand side is Annie Lorraine, and behind her is Annie Narell. And the person with the orange painting is William Henry. He's the CEO of the Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation. Then there's Mandy, the manager, and then next to that is Sue. We're all holding her painting, and then obviously Fiona. Thanks, Fiona. So the research context. So what it's, and I'm just going to flick through this as a summary because we thought it was really important to get to the data, to the findings. But we realised when I was looking at the research that we know there are structural issues that increase the chances of Aboriginal families' involvement with the child protection system. the literature is pretty clear, as are the findings, that there are ongoing impacts of continued colonisation. It is well established. In New South Wales specifically, Aboriginal children are 11 times more likely to be removed than non-Indigenous children. And it is projected that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children will double, the numbers will double in 10 years' time. And we found that there was very little literature exploring the social and emotional wellbeing needs of Aboriginal practitioners in an out-of-home care context, specifically in Aboriginal out-of-home care. So the aim in the questions, or question, it shouldn't be questions, it was to address the gap in literature on Aboriginal practitioners' social and emotional wellbeing needs in the context of Aboriginal out-of-home care. And the question was looking at what hinders and supports the social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal out-of-home care practitioners in the provision of culturally situated trauma-informed practice in an out-of-home care context. And this is just a summary of the methodology. So we use decolonising research. It is an Indigenous informed, or was, feels like it's a continuation, Indigenous informed participatory action research. And as you can see, which is a summary of the previous slide around participation, there was an Aboriginal advisory group that continues. There were a range of methods used. So yarning for individual, with individuals, and yarning as group sessions. I gathered reports and casework documents, those kinds of things. I attended the space a day a week or intermittently for about a year, and then we had COVID, and so I was doing lots of Zoom sessions and speaking with staff and carers throughout that period over COVID, reflexive writing and co-analysis sessions as well. And this is just one example of the participatory action cycles. So this is where we gathered data and participated in co-analysis and had conversations around the development of questions and the cycles that we went through to gather that information. And there's also images that explain what we did with the Aboriginal practitioners who work in the organisation and carers as well. So there's separate images to explain those. Thanks, Fiona. So we're at the findings. And when I was looking at the data and starting to code through the analysis process, there are some fairly significant I guess, sub-themes that came out of the data that I then took back to the practitioners and to the advisory group. And the first one that really stood out was the strength of culture.
Yep. So some of the examples of statements were going back to country, going back on country helps me feel more connected. We keep community and family in mind all the time, and there is no 9 to 5.
And the two worlds, sorry, I'll read that in a minute, sorry. And then the next one was the complexities of working in this space and boundary setting for Aboriginal staff.
Yep, so one of the examples there is holding multiple cultural obligations was raised regularly throughout the yarning sessions and was associated with both resilience and challenge.
And then another one that was really significant was the community's expectations of the broader Aboriginal community and what they expected of the staff.
And cultural connection was difficult at times because participants were sometimes unsure about who to connect with in community.
And then it became obvious that while there was strength, there's much strength in the identification and experiences of culture, there's also the emotional toll the work takes on Aboriginal staff.
That this relates to the emotional toll the work takes on the staff.
Sorry, I read your slide, Fiona. And so we came to this idea that on the whole, Aboriginal speak to walking in two worlds. And so there was this kind of, I guess, play on words of two world walking and the ideas of boundary crossing. And the two worlds are the black world of an Aboriginal person and the colonial settler world. Aboriginal participants shared what keeps them strong as they navigate working between the two worlds. Aboriginal people in Mirrabah hold multiple roles in their work and personal lives. These include their substantive position as a worker or carer and then the reciprocal obligations held with family and community. Many participants shared stories of personal struggle at the same time as managing the workload expectations within the program. And two-world walking is the complex, entangled and situated position Aboriginal people are in. The two worlds are the Aboriginal world with cultural connections, obligations and responsibilities to community and country, and these are seen as strengths and really important assets, and the dominant Western world where there is a requirement to comply with legislation, policy and practice. And in this slide, it's a summary of the range of, I mean, essentially it's the words, but the ideas that came through from all of the conversations that showed, and unintentionally, but it's happened. On the right side are what were considered the strengths and the assets, the parts of being Aboriginal and being involved in an Aboriginal service that were seen to really strengthen or felt to really strengthen an Aboriginal person. And then on the left-hand side are the range of elements that create the emotional labour, so that draw on the emotional toll of being, and some examples you can see here are experiencing cultural practices. So being able to participate in cultural practices, working in an Aboriginal, so ACO, working an Aboriginal community controlled organisation was really important to Aboriginal practitioners. Having the opportunity to go back on country was essential, though Aboriginal people who were off country found that they had very limited time to be able to have opportunities to go back on country. I won't go through all of them because Fiona's going to read something in a moment. And then you can see on the left-hand side, there is the history of colonisation and the ongoing experience of colonisation, structural oppression, experiences and stories of stolen generations, systemic racism. Thanks, Fiona.
I have big fingers, I think, especially at these times. So this painting is Suzanne Truman's painting, The Walking in the Two Worlds, and Sue's put together something for me to read. So the painting depicts Dharawal country with the two mountains, Mount Kira and Mount Kembla, which are significant to the Illawarra, where our song and storylines began. The circle in the middle represents Mirrabah, which is located between the mountains and the sea. They are Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal coming together, sitting around a circle. The footprints represent the workers and the children coming to Mirrabah from many different Aboriginal nations with their own perspective on culture. Culture is within you. You have lived it, learning from the day you were born about how and why things are, being taught in subtle ways to have a strong cultural base by our Aboriginal mothers, fathers and grandparents who learnt from the elders before them. For our children in out-of-home care, it's important they also learn about culture to keep their spirits strong. The painting is intentionally black and white, representing both black and white cultures, and the dual role walking and working in two worlds to reflect Aboriginal workers, cultural responsibilities and obligations, as well as the responsibilities and formal requirements of working with the children in out-of-home care and the Department of Communities and Justice. Mountains and trees represent knowledge, strength and wisdom. The leaves depicted in the painting are part of the trees, and they are continually renewing themselves with the many challenges they face from wind, rain, drought and fire through the changing of the seasons. In the painting, each leaf represents the many challenges workers are faced with working in the out-of-home care situation. Their challenges are not static, they are continually evolving. Working in this space can be unbalanced. Sharing the history and the current experience of Aboriginal people is important. It represents the concepts of having a double job, holding the roles and responsibilities of being an Aboriginal person whilst also complying with the requirements of the colonial world. Often the culture comes second to all the things that the worker has to do with mandatory recording, note recording. It overlooks everything that is the hierarchy. Workers don't get paid for yarning about culture, which is an important component when working with Aboriginal children to promote a strong cultural identity. Workers can't be told what to do in a cultural sense, as it is in ways of knowing, being and doing. Cultural ways of coming together, bringing food and yarning about challenges and finding solutions should be considered as work, as this requires workers to use their cultural knowledge and skills as part of their roles. Our Aboriginal workers have to juggle all of these elements. This image is to empower Aboriginal people working in this space and recognise their commitment to our Aboriginal children who are our future.
Thanks, Fiona.
About 4.5 minutes to go for you, Sam.
Thanks, Lynne. So this just brings us to just a very short summary of the implications that it was agreed were identified from this piece around walking or towards walking. And one of those is significant in that it's around the ensuring of the social and emotional wellbeing for Aboriginal practitioners in Aboriginal organisations doing out-of-home care with Aboriginal children. And so this is just a summary. It's my image and it needs to be interpreted and probably turned into an image like the other image that was just shown. But this is just a summary of some of the elements that were considered to be important for social and emotional wellbeing for Aboriginal practitioners. And you can see it's incorporating clinical and cultural supervision. It's having a really strong workplace culture that would be or is cocooned in culture, so that it's surrounded by cultural practices and incorporated into all of the enactment of practices that happen within the organisation. And then the physical environment of the space, so having spaces for outdoor yarning and having images that represent Aboriginal culture within the organisation, and ensuring the cultural care of staff and carers. And it's believed that at the bottom, it's believed that if this was enacted, then there would be improved outcomes such as continuity of staff. So where there's been high turnover, that would be reduced, that there would be a reduction in crisis responses for practitioners towards children and carers. The carers would feel a greater sense of satisfaction and that there would be an increased sense of belonging for the Aboriginal children who are involved in Mirrabah. Thanks, Fiona. And then importantly for non-Indigenous practitioners working either in this space or because it's argued that the ideas actually extend beyond Aboriginal out-of-home care and towards all Aboriginal practitioners who are in identified positions where they're required to bring their cultural selves to the work, where they don't get to switch off from that role when they go home. And that for non-Indigenous practitioners, that it's important for us to be thinking about decolonising practices. So what can we know and how can we be and what can we do to ensure an increased sense of cultural safety for Aboriginal practitioners in this space? With a minute to go. And these are the co-researchers who've been involved that have participated in the Aboriginal Advisory Group. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Fiona. We're a little bit behind time, but we've made up a little bit of time, which is good. So we've got some questions now for all three. And I think it was very interesting the way we started with Mark's big picture of what civil society organisations do. And then we moved in a little to our coalition across 3 states, really foregrounding the lived experience of parents and parents' rights. And then we moved in again to one ARCO and looked at Aboriginal practitioners, carers and children in our home care. So there was quite a synergy, I think, between the person who did the order of presentation
Knew what they were
knew
doing.
what they were doing. So on that, who's got some questions for either Mark, the mob that we have here and on screen, or Sam and Fiona? No questions? Yes.
You know, I'm also the frontline worker of domestic violence.
Yes.
In Cumberland, and sexual abuse and sexual violence. And as a community worker, during my experience, I have seen, even I have also participated in the forced marriages, the people like, the workers, maybe the child protection or the violence, they are doing their job very good. They want to implement the policies of the government, but I'm just sometimes I see in the community, they don't trust the workers because they say they don't provide the culturally appropriate services. Once I was in the Muslim refuge and I contacted commander, he's very good, I told them how the works in, they say we will cooperate with you. But once the case came of the Muslim women, she ran away from the house. And he was very reluctant to speak with me. He said, Rubina, will you give them protection? I said, sure. Anyone who has gone through the thing, we will do that. And the other case, the children, he fell down. There was some blood clotting in the head, and in the hospital people, they just called the child protection people and they gave the children away from their parents. So I am not sure, I don't say that you people are doing very wonderful job, even I am also involved. But sometimes you must have to study the culture, religion, and the services should be culturally appropriate. So I don't know what's your experience, but I have gone through different cases. So I've just mentioned this thing at the time.
Does any of the presentations want to respond to I guess it's the question about the importance of practice being culturally situated?
Absolutely. I think one of the problems is that people don't have the resources to adequately have the time to reflect on it and learn from the people who can tell them the most. And if people had sort of had free money that they didn't have tied to already things, they're exactly the kind of things that, a bit of visionary money can bring you. You can go and spend that time research, listening to people about and co-design it from the beginning. But most organisations don't get that opportunity. And again, there's never one point of view, is there? So you've also got to somehow bring together those challenging different points of view within a community. I see a lot of organisations trying to do it, but it's not for lack of interest but doing it to scale and doing it in the most inclusive way possible is really hard with no resources, and unless people can find a bucket of money, which a lot of people tend to use philanthropy money for. But I have seen examples where people are trying really hard and have done amazing on, what they had. And in the same with Aboriginal people, it's very much how do you get that direct. And the timing, it's not a consultation, you want to co-design.
Can I? Oh, sorry. So I was just going to speak to that as well.
Would the people on the screen mind putting their cameras on? Yeah, thanks, Fiona.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with what Karen's saying, is that we've been doing this work at FinWA for a long time and considering and thinking about all cultures when we do this, but there is no funding attached to actually doing that properly and going back to that co-design. So here, at the moment, even though we're doing family partner work, we're going back to the beginning to look at how we embed family partner work in FinWA. But to do that back at the co-design, we've had to go to Lottery West and apply for a significant amount of funding from them so that we can include parents and community in that consultation process, but then also Aboriginal community, the COLD community, so working with Multicultural Migrant Resource Centre and places like those, but then we can't actually pay them for that. So then we go back to, like your point, Maddie, of being able to enumerate people properly for that. That was really cool. So it's just so hard because it's not resourced. So it's not from the lack of trying or the lack of considering, it's just being able to resource it appropriately.
Thank you. I think we've got a question up the back.
Yeah, I had a question. I think it's for Karen, from the Family Inclusion Network. You were talking about it taking 4 years and there being this really hard work of finding common ground, and because everyone had different needs. Could you just explain a bit more, like how those needs were so different, I guess?
Oh, I guess it was more about the language of it, and because it had never been sort of experienced before, it was just toing and froing, like, because we'd put it in a way that was discussed with parents and, like trying to get everyone's point of view, as you say, so many points of view, but every time it was conflicting. So we had to really balance that out, and it was really hard work because you would think one word wouldn't make a difference. It does. So, it was just, I felt like I went to so many workshops for that, and we had a bigger parent group at one stage and it sort of dwindled down, and because people have things come and go in their life as well. So it was like sort of working with different people, and then it went to different districts as well. So it was like, who's it with? So it's very, it was fun. It was, I was so glad at the launch. It was just like, thank God, it's there. But it was a lot of heartache, because it's just like trying to even just get those points across was just so hard. So, but we got there. So well done. Yeah.
Xavier, do you have a question? You've got your mic on. Oh, that's you. Sorry, Xavier. Do you have a question, Xavier?
So can people ask questions?
Yeah. Is there anybody that is tuning in virtually want to ask a question?
I had a question, Lynne, which was for Mark about with the data gathering that you did, Mark, whether you included volunteer organisations or only government and philanthropically funded organisations.
Thanks. No, we did include volunteer organisations. It also included some small businesses. So we didn't make any distinction about who we talked to. We just wanted to talk to people who were trying to help people during COVID. So, volunteer organisations, absolutely.
Thanks.
Yes.
I guess I have more of just a comment that it seemed like across all three of the presentations, sort of interesting to hear in the evidence of how over time in the past, 5-10 years, that our sector has become the greater sort of professionalization of the work has in some ways made people more distant from the community, and that, as our organizations become more, market driven or focused on professionalizing the staff, now there's sort of a swing back of wanting to be more connected to the community, wanting to have lived experience voice, but we've gone so far the other direction that it's sort of steering a big ship and trying to make it fit in a way that those are some of those closer connections to people and communities that we might have had more of 20 years ago. So I guess just more of a comment that it just seems like part of a broader trend across the sector as well.
Fiona, would you like to comment on the, you don't have to, but on the struggle for an ARCO in meeting its very strict legislative and compliance regimes with, children in our home care and being embedded and connected to community and country?
Yeah, and I guess the difficulties is that we've always known that connection to community and culture is number one. and healing through culture is the way that we heal and we thrive, and how our kids are going to heal and know who they are through their own identity. Culture isn't recognised as the most important part of out-of-home care legislation. So it's about ticking boxes and making sure that they've got a case plan, they've got their carers have got working with children's check, like all the important things, but culture is often missed. And then any activities that we do with children, there's not a focus or funding for that. They have to have a cultural plan, and a lot of times the cultural plan is very, very tokenistic, and we call them ticker boxes. And as long as we've got a cultural plan that says that this child's Aboriginal and this child's mum was Aboriginal or is Aboriginal, then that's a tick and flick, where our focus as an Aboriginal community controlled organisation is more about, we know culture is much more than that, and it means a lot more than that. So we go a lot further than that. So we need to know who their mob are, who their parents' mob are, who they're connected to in community, who their elders are. And we do really big genograms that go back 8 generations to connect them to many nations, because sorry, I'm on my soapbox, because of the colonisation, people were removed from their lands and placed into lands that they weren't known to, or traditional owners, and now they've got to fit into the box of where they're living now, many generations later. It's just very, very complex.
Thank you, Fiona. I think time's up. So thank you to Mark. Thank you for the wonderful presentation about embedding or foregrounding parents' voices and rights in child protection. And thanks to Sam and Fiona for your presentation on Aboriginal workers working with children in development. Thank you.